quite linear. You will also probably realize it's never that nice, right? It's a lot more messy. And so I think that this is not the right answer. I think it's too simple. The sea peoples are part of it, yes, but they're not the sole reason. And in fact, I think they might have been as much the victims as they were the oppressors. That is, they are one of the symptoms of this, but I don't think they're the cause. I think they are a bogeyman that's been used to scare little kids for the last couple of generations, or at least if your parents are archaeologists, it was. So I was skeptical, shall we say, and I wanted to look around for what really happened. So what I want to present to you today is my alternate hypothesis for what caused the collapse, and then see what you think of it. Now, I remind you that we've got a globalized society for that time period.
Third phase. Welcome back to Third Phase of Moon. My name is Blake Cousins, and in this episode, we're going to release an amazing video sent to us by Open Minds TV at the UFO International Conference. Now let's take a look at this video right now. Please help me welcome Michael Schramm.
I knew that was going to happen. God damn it.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Okay. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I want to thank Open Minds for giving me the opportunity to join all of you today. And what I'd like to do for you this morning is give you a brief overview of Project Aquarius and give you some specific details regarding the interaction that Dr. Dan Burish had with an extraterrestrial called J-Rod. And we've got some very quick announcements before we begin here. Number one, the information, drawings, and illustrations highlighted in this presentation originated from directly the testimony and direction of Dr. Dan Burish. So in other words, I didn't make this up. This comes directly from Dr. Dan Burish. He will be available after this presentation to address all your questions. And number two, as a disclaimer, the drawings and computer-generated forensic composite illustrations shown in this presentation do not conform 100% to Dr. Dan and Marcy's testimony or descriptions and should be considered strictly as a visual aid, specifically designed to give the general public an overall idea of what the S4 facility looked like. So in other words, I didn't get this 100% correct. There are some minor errors here and there in the renderings, but it's definitely sufficient to give all of us here today a good understanding and visual aid regarding what the S4 facility looked like. Now, this is the breakdown of what we'll be talking about today. I'll give you a background on Dr. Dan Burish. We'll be discussing level 4-1. We'll be talking about walking the line. We'll describe what that actually means, what it pertains to. I'm going to give you a virtual blueprint floor-by-floor walkthrough of the 9 hangar bays and all the way through the facility. We'll consider the extraterrestrial and alien craft because there is a difference. We'll talk about the Roswell craft. We'll talk about the propulsion research laboratory at S4. We'll consider the catwalk, the files department, and the cafeteria. For level 4-2, we'll consider Project Sidekick, the weapons research and development, Alice in Wonderland Rabbit, this is a good historical note, Looking Glass Device, Stargate's ERBs or Angeles Microscopical Society. And in 1985, he received his bachelor degree in biological sciences, and in 1986, a bachelor degree in psychology. In 1987, Dan explored the feasibility of becoming a priest here at St. Patrick's School of Theology. However, that didn't quite work out, so we actually had to bypass that. Now, in 1989, it was Dr. Edward Teller who arranged for Dan to take classes at the University of New York, Stony Brook, and he earned his PhD there. So I asked this question to all of you. Where have we seen this gentleman before? Dr. Edward Teller, where have we seen him come up in the stories of these type craft and vehicles before? It was none other than Dr. Teller who arranged for, allegedly, Bob to get his interview at EG&G at McCarran International Airport, and that's how he got his job at S4. So we have secondary independent confirmation that Dr. Edward Teller was involved. In 1991, he was employed at Desert Storm as a biowarfare expert. Now, in 1994, he received his Q clearance at S4, and he began working on something called Project Aquarius. And I will draw your attention here to the aircraft sectional chart that anyone can get at any local airport. This is something that's readily available. And if you look up here on the right-hand corner, you've got R-4808N. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the most highly guarded airspace, Dreamland airspace in America. This is the borderline here. You'll notice Groom Lake is right up here, so we can see it does exist. Approximately 12 miles south of Groom Lake, there's something called Papoose Lake, or Area S4. And it's important to note that if you ever try to break into this airspace within the 4808N airspace Dreamland, three things immediately happen. Number one, ATC at Dreamland, air traffic control, will not allow you clearance to enter into their airspace. Number two, they will immediately, if you do not egress the area, they will immediately scramble an F-16 who will perform a particular maneuver where they'll fly perpendicular to your flight path at about 100 feet away from your aircraft. And then when you fly into his jet wash, it will either depart from controlled flight, or you might end up wrecking one of your wings or tearing one of your wings off. So that's the second thing. And the third and final thing is you'll receive a final warning to exit the area. And if nothing happens, they will lock on with a Sidewinder missile and they will neutralize the target. So the bottom line is, don't try to break into Dreamland airspace. Okay, so at S4, again, he received his clearance and he worked under the direction of the Naval Research Laboratory and the Defense Intelligence Agency. So these are the two outfits that are running the program at Area S4. The EG&G terminal, 737-200, how do you get to Area S4? Well, it's the EG&G terminal, which is the gateway to Area 51 and S4. As you're flying on this airliner here, just before the hairpin turn into the landing approach on Groom Lake runway, which is a 27,000-foot runway. It's the largest runway in the world. There's an ATC clearance called Pyramid. That is the clearance to land at Groom Lake. And what's interesting, a historical point from Dan Burrish indicated that on the trip on the 737-200 to Groom Lake, they played Neil Diamond's song Coming to America over and over and over again. So the question is, what is the encrypted symbolic message that they're playing on the airplane as you're going there? Well, under its original interpretation, that song talks about immigrants coming to America to make a better life for themselves. That makes a lot of sense. But under the direction of what happens at S4, it actually is talking about extraterrestrials coming to America, and specifically at S4. That was confirmed by Dan Burrish as the correct interpretation. Now, when you land at Groom Lake, how do you get to S4? It's 12 miles away. There's three ways. You can take a blue-colored Air Force bus. That's number one. Number two, you take a U.S. Army Black Hawk helicopter. The third and final option is a Russian Mi-24 Hindy helicopter gunship. So those are the three options that you take to get to S4. Now we're flying, we've just landed, we're at the helicopter landing pad. We're now going to enter the facility for a virtual walkthrough. And you'll notice that there are some very interesting lines here on the tarmac. We have two parallel red lines, okay? And then there are two parallel blue lines. This is called walking the line. And you are told, according to Dan Burrish, and this is a very oppressive society, it's not a user-friendly area. It's not something that is a nice place to be at. There's black guards with guns, and it's an oppressive society. You are told to follow the blue lines and do not breach the boundaries of the red lines, because if you do, ladies and gentlemen, they will shoot you. That's the level of security that we're talking about here. Now, we're entering the facility, and you'll see this swinging door to enter the facility. It turns out that that is actually incorrect, so we've made the correction. The actual door to get into the S4 facility is none other than a double sliding glass door with an indented receptacle, which is circular. You turn that to the right, that's how you get into the facility. Very similar to what you would switch to. We've got 4-3, 4-4, and 4-5. We flip to the AutoCAD rendering to give you an idea of what that facility looks like. Keep in mind that anything below 4-1 is all underground. Now, area S4, 4-1, this is the blueprint that I was able to put together under the direction of Dr. Dan Burish. And if the first thing that happens when you walk in this facility, you enter that door, what you see is this long hallway here, very long hallway. It has the same type line configuration or stripes on the floor. To the left, you'll see a red line. You cannot go to the left. On the right, there's a blue line. You can get access to that. So we're walking up here. The first room to the left, ladies and gentlemen, is actually the avionics lab. Just beyond that is the propulsion systems lab. Over here, we have a files department, and we have something called the briefing room. This is a very important room, the briefing room. Why? Because there's something called King Tuts or training update tapes, and they have something called blue 3-ring DTIC binders, which is Defense Technical and Information Center binders. So I just submit, we've all heard this thing about Carl Sagan stating that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Well, here's where the evidence is. This facility, they not only have the hardware, but they've got the tissue samples, they've got the motion picture film reels, they've got the high visual digital audio tapes. It's all here. This is what we're looking for. So on the far western wall, on the interior of each of the 9 hangar bays, there is a 4-1 in red paint circled by a red circle. So that indicates that you are at area 4, floor 1. That's the significance there. The first hangar bay, which is right here, this is hangar bay number 1, was none other than Bob Lazar's sport model, or a P-45 sport model. Hangar bay number 2, we believe to be the exact same vehicle, or possibly an ARV, alien reproduction vehicle. Hangar bay 3, ladies and gentlemen, was the Roswell craft, which was covered by a tarp, so Dan didn't get to see the entire configuration, but it was the Roswell craft. Next, we have in the next hangar, which is number 4, is the P-52 Orion craft. The next hangar bay 5 was empty. Hangar bay 6 contained a man-made F-22 conversion, or sort of a dog and pony show of what was in hangar bay 3. So it was a man-made version of the Roswell craft. Up here we have, it's believed to be the 1953 crash retrieval in Kingman, Arizona. That was what was in the next hangar, which is 7. Hangar bay 8 contained a black isosceles triangle that was nicknamed the licorice drop. Hangar bay 9, ladies and gentlemen, was empty. So that's the layout here. Up on the left-hand corner, I've got a very crude gymnasium lighting. That's the important thing to remember. When you're in this facility, it's not impeccable lighting on the first floor. So that's why we have that. Moving over to the right, we have the biohazard suppression area. We have the overflow files department. And then we have the communication area. And then you'll look over to the bottom right here is the meals ready to eat, or the cafeteria. And you'll notice here that the different colors indicate the compartmentalization of the people who work on different programs at Area S4. So if you work on Project Sidekick, or if you work on Project Galileo, you sit in the red area. If you work on weapons research, you sit in the black area. As we mentioned, orange area is Project Looking Glass. So what they're doing is they're quarantining the employees and engineers who work on the different programs so that these things remain secret. Okay, so this is a far look down of the main hallway. As soon as you walk in, you see that red stripe and the blue stripe on the right-hand side. We've got the avionics lab and the propulsion system labs on the immediate left-hand side. Now, right to the left, there is an I Want to Believe poster confirmed by Dr. Dan Burrish. Over to the right, there is a nurse there and a weighing pad. So all this talk about trying to smuggle things out of S4 so that we can prove all this is real, well, it's next to impossible. Why? Because they weigh you in the nude when you get there, and they weigh you in the nude when you get out. And if there's a discrepancy within ounces, it's over. So you got to be very careful here. Now, 4-1, looking down through the catwalk to the left-hand side. This is the first hangar bay, is the 52-foot diameter Bob Lazar sport model. So we're looking down through the catwalk. Over here we have hangar bay 2, which again is believed to be the same craft or an alien reproduction vehicle. Hangar bay 3 is the P-24 Roswell craft. You'll notice the 4-1, we're at area S4, level 1. Now, this is interesting. I did not make this statement, but Dr. Dan Burrish and even the late geologist Dr. Phil Schneider indicated that the F-22 Raptor, the exterior configuration of the F-22 Raptor was originating from the original Roswell craft. That's a very bombshell statement to make, but if you take away the vertical stabilizers on the F-22 Raptor and then you remove the air intakes and then you do something what Dan Burrish told me, is if you drew a spline curve and connected all of the major points or intersecting areas on the Raptor, what you'd end up with, ladies and gentlemen, is the Roswell craft. So this comes directly from Dan Burrish. Is there any way to prove this? Well, take a look at the historical legacy on the origin point of stealth technology. And we'll start up here. There is a defining feature that goes through all these configurations. You've got the FB-22 up here. We've got a Russian stealth configuration here. Down here to the left, we've got a Northrop configuration. Just to the right of that, we've got the Testers Model Corporation, Rockford, Illinois, the F-19 configuration by Lockheed, and then we've got the configuration from the movie Stealth, which was released in 2005. All these configurations contain the same design model. In fact, they contain the same wing root to fuselage joint, which is completely integrated and smooth contoured, identical to the B-2 stealth bomber to reduce the radar cross signature. That is the defining design feature on these stealth technologies, the same thing you'll see in the Roswell craft. Hangar Bay 4 was a P-52 Orion craft. This is the original configuration. This is the cleaned up configuration on the bottom side by Dr. Dan Burrish. Hangar bays 5 and bays 9 were empty. And you'll notice too that there are these interesting tracks here, and these were used to pull the craft out of the hangar bays so that they could be test flown on the tarmac immediately from the entrance of the facility. Hangar Bay 6 was the man-made reproduction of the P-24 Roswell craft that was in Hangar Bay 6. Hangar Bay 7, again, that Dan believed, but not could be completely confirmed, that this was the 1953 Kingman UFO crash retrieval vehicle, was covered by a tarp. Hangar Bay 8 contained a black isosceles triangle. They called it the licorice drop, according to Dan Burrish. And I will mention that everything from Hangar Bay 1 to Hangar Bay 7 were all extraterrestrial vehicles. Hangar Bay 8 was the only alien vehicle because there's a difference between extraterrestrials and aliens. And according to Dr. Dan Burrish, the exterior configuration, or what it looked like when you saw this craft, it looked like a black liquid mercury that you could fall into. It was a very unique surface texture on this particular craft. So we've got Bob Lazar stating that S4 exists. That's what he said back in 1988, 1989. We've got Dr. Dan Burrish coming forward stating that S4 exists. We also have Bill Uhouse, who worked on the flight simulators at S4 and at Los Alamos National Lab. So we've got 3 independent people confirming the same thing. You'll see the cutaway AutoCAD drawing originating from Bill Uhouse, indicating that there was a flight simulator a flying saucer flight simulator that was attached to a gimbal mount, and you can rotate this thing almost up to 90 degrees. There was a diagnostic cable attached to the vehicle when it was static, but when it was energized, the diagnostic cable gets released, and then you could quote unquote fly the vehicle at that time. So the P45 craft was the sport model, measured 52 feet in diameter, was 16 feet high. It had a smooth, polished aluminum exterior configuration. And then I want to take you inside here and show you some of the interior components. It had 3 different levels. We've got the lower bay, we've got the mid deck, and the upper deck. So that's what we've got right there. Now let's zoom inside. We'll take a look at what it looks like inside. On the bottom section of the vehicle, there were 3 gravity amplifiers. Right above that, we have the mid deck, which contained 3 gravity amplifier heads, 3 seats that all sat in the same direction, which were too small for human test pilots to fit into. Then we've got a gravity amplifier system here. We've got a antimatter reactor and a waveguide that goes all the way up through the mid deck and what we believe to be the avionics or navigation department right here, and these are not windows. So that's the layout of the sport model according to Mr. Bob Lazar. Now, spend 15 seconds on the propulsion system of this vehicle. Element 115 is machined into triangles at Los Alamos, transported to S4. It is loaded into the antimatter reactor, and then the target substance is bombarded with protons. And when a proton plugs into the nucleus of an atom of element 115, it bumps its atomic number up to element 116, which immediately decays and releases antimatter. That is the power source for the vehicle in a near 100% thermoelectric generator. So that's a breakdown of the propulsion system. Project Aquarius terminology. Let's talk about some terminology here. Project Galileo. Project Aquarius is nothing more than an umbrella term for everything having to do with mankind's interaction with extraterrestrials. Below that, there are about 5 different programs. The first one is Project Galileo. It dealt with the propulsion system of extraterrestrial and future terrestrial vehicles. So that was the first one. Second one under Project Aquarius was Project Sidekick. Relates to a weapons program. No further information is available from Dan Burish on that program. Project Looking Glass dealt with the physics of seeing the effects of an artificially produced gravity wave on time. The fourth project was a second generation weapons program, which originated with Project Sidekick, no program name provided. The fifth program dealt with a series of biological defense operations, which Dan served in the capacity of senior scientist. So those are the programs that fell under Project Aquarius. So how did the J-Rod craft, or what was termed the Kingman 1953 UFO crash retrieval, how did it get to S4? Ladies and gentlemen, it got there by a 40-ton, what's called a Dragon Wagon tank hauler. That's how they got it there to the facility. Now, in 1953, according to Dr. Dan Burish, there was a UFO crash retrieval at Kingman, Arizona. There were 3 bodies recovered. 1 died on impact. He was still contained to his biocontainment device. The other one went to Los Alamos, and the third and final one went to Area 51 S4. That's the J-Rod that Dan Burish worked with. Now, in 1954, according to Dan Burish, there was a meeting between President Dwight D. Eisenhower and representatives of the P-52 Orions, and a treaty was signed. A copy of that treaty was kept at Area S4 Level 4-1, and they also gave President Eisenhower something called the Orion Cube, which we'll talk about as well. What is the Orion Cube? It was also known as the Yellow Book. It has nothing to do with phone numbers, okay? What it is it's a 8 by 8 inch square cube, and it's a quantum viewing device that you could, once it's accessed, you could look at the probabilities of future events. There was protocols that had to be followed in order to activate this. And at one time, it's believed that this cube was stored at level 4-1. Later, it was moved to the Scottish Rite Masonic Temple just outside Washington, D.C. From that point further, we don't know where it is. So that's the lineage of the Orion Cube. Now, interesting to note that There are 3 events that took place in 1947. Is there a coincidence? I don't think there is. We've got the Roswell crash on July 2nd, 1947. Then we've got the formation of the CIA in 1947 and the formation of the Independent Air Force also in 1947. 3 events happening at the same time. In 1952, it was the National Security Agency who, according to the CIA, had improper intelligence. So partial majestic control of Project Aquarius was handed over to the, quote, new boys on the block because they came after the Central Intelligence Agency. So there was this animosity that continues today between the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Agency. Now, moving down to 4-2, we've got the SolidWorks rendering and also the AutoCAD rendering of 4-2. Moving into the facility, the first thing you'll see when you look and walk into level 4-2 is a 3-foot tall statue of an Alice in Wonderland rabbit. There's a symbolic message that they're giving you here. There's a primary looking glass device, and then on either side of that primary looking glass device, ladies and gentlemen, there are 2 secondary ERBs or Einstein-Rosen bridges. Up on the left, I've got a graphic of termed the galactic positioning codes, because when you access a Stargate at the S4 facility, you don't need to have a galactic positioning code arm or flip book, because all that data is inside the control room. But when you go outside S4, you do need to get this positioning code data so that you know where you're going. Here we've got the jump pads at 4-2. And then down here, we've got the Project Sidekick storage facility, also one just below that. To the right, we've got weapons research and development. I've got a blown up view of the looking glass device here. We're going to consider something called the doctrine of convergent timeline paradox. And then we're also going to consider, how did the US government get the technology to access naturally occurring stargates throughout the world? It has to do with the Sumerian seals that were recovered in Baghdad years ago. Now, this is a SolidWorks rendering of the looking glass device. You'll notice that there's this toroid or donut ring-shaped device. And inside this have multiple permanent electromagnets. And this is consistent with 6 electromagnetic fields that form above this device. There is a up and down actuating rotating cylinder. So it's a height adjustable rotating cylinder, which is attached to a 3-axis gimbal system. That's the general layout of the looking glass device. Now, what does this thing do? Well, it can actually warp the fabric of space-time, both forwards and back, and you can actually see the probabilities of future events. That's the primary function. However, there's a secret to the looking glass device, which Dan Burrish has told us. What you can do is you can flip this device up at 45-degree angle, and if you tune it to a slightly different frequency, it can be used as a stargate. So it actually has a dual purpose. You've got these spires or guide rings just above the looking glass device. These are used to guide the electromagnetic field over the looking glass device. It's something that you can hit with your hand. Now, per Dan's comments, there was a 3-foot tall statue of an Alice in Wonderland rabbit. He had a maroon vest, he had golden fringes, and he had black buttons. He was holding a clock. And this is symbolic that you're going down the rabbit hole into a world that's beyond belief. And that's exactly what happens in the looking glass area. So it was a symbolic encrypted message. Now, when we talk about time travel and we talk about the doctrine of convergent timeline paradox, in my assessment, there is no better illustration of this concept than the movie Back to the Future 2. And they talk about this in that movie. So just to illustrate this, for example, on the bottom here, we've got something called the flow of time, representative of the bottom arrow or timeline 1. That's the timeline we're on. So we're moving down this timeline and everything is fine, everything is great. And then somebody decides to flip on one of these looking glass devices. And this is called the looking glass point of observation. That's right here. Now, We have someone that is looking into the future of probable events. At that point, at that exact point in time, we are no longer, ladies and gentlemen, on timeline 1, but we are now on timeline 2. And we have theoretically we have affected our future timeline 1. So that's how this works. Now, in this movie, a DeLorean is used to go from the year 1985 to the year 2015. And a character by the name of Biff Tannen, he eventually comes into possession of something called the Gray's Sports Almanac, 1950 to 2005. He picks this up from an 80s memorabilia store. He goes back to the year 1985, and it's a cakewalk. He knows all the results, all the sports scores, to the horse racing, to NFL, to hockey. He turns out to be a billionaire. It's just incredible. But in the process of doing that, he completely destroys himself, everyone he's with, and everything, all the surroundings. So you can see of the catastrophic consequences of looking into the future. It has a very serious consequence. And that's borne out by what we see here with the Mayan calendar. Some believe, ladies and gentlemen, that on December 21st of 2012, it's the end of the world. However, some take a more positive approach and indicate that this is a new dawning of an age of enlightenment. And this is, if we flip over to the prophecy rock by the Hopis here, they have a similar motif. They talk about the evolution of mankind's consciousness on this bottom straight line. And then something happens. An event takes place where we go off into chaos. And that's what you see with the squiggly line. So again, it's very destructive in some cases to try to predict future events. It can have catastrophic consequences. Here you see the rendering, 3D Max Studio rendering of the Looking Glass device. We've got the transport pads in this location. Everything that took place in this facility was recorded on digital videotape. So they have the evidence. There's no question about it. You can see the electromagnetic fields forming above the Looking Glass device. There was a stand clear yellow and black stripe that followed the circumference of the Looking Glass device. Now again, this is Dan Burrish's rendering. We talked about the Looking Glass configuration. It's the general configuration on the upper left-hand corner. And then on the upper right-hand corner, we've rotated the device 45 degrees from the horizontal, and now it's in the, quote, Stargate configuration. So that's what we see there. The flip book, this was something that engineers wore on their arms, and it was kind of a GPS code book, because you have to know where you are and where you're going when you operate or access one of these Stargates. Now, some of you may have seen the movie Stargate. The actual Stargate looks nothing like what you see in the movies. The only thing that is consistent is this metal catwalk that gets you into the actual Stargate. That's the only similarity in the entire operation. Level S4, level 3. We're moving on to level 3. This is the SolidWorks rendering. Below, we have the AutoCAD rendering. Now, there are at least 3 primary areas to 4-3. You'll notice that there are 3 distinct segments here. Each has 4 residential suites. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the Majestic 12 residential suites. That's where they stay when they get to S4. It consists of a very simple 1-bedroom apartment with a sunken living area. There's a tile walkway to enter the facility. There's a single TV. There's 1 single bathroom. So that's the S4 Majestic 12 residential suite. You also know that we've got the culture department. We've got the analysis department just to the right and below the culture department. Up here on the right, we've got the call-outs, the leader call-outs. We've got slider trays. We've got pressure incubators. And when I was going through this, it really dawned on me that there's a lot of attention to detail here. And it was my assessment that this was coming from a man who had practical application experience in working in this environment. I mean, it just seemed to me that you couldn't make this up. There was a lot of detail here. It really seemed that this was someone who could speak from experience that was actually working in the facility. Now, level 4-4, that's what we're moving on to now. A number of primary areas here. We have the badge board. This is a blow up of the badge board on 4-4. We've got a meeting room or a board room in that facility. There are multiple bio-containment labs in level 4-4, and we'll zoom in and blow up that area right here. These are the decontamination areas, and Dan Burrish's desk at S4, level 4-4, was right in this facility right here. So again, the level of attention to detail to me was just astounding. It really seemed like someone who was actually working there. Now, some of you may have seen this before. This is Dan Burrish's security badge at S4. We've got MADGE here, that's short for Majestic. That was the program that was operated under Truman in 1947. And then we've got these diagonally striped blue and darker blue running along the upper left-hand corner. This is the same configuration that Bob Lazar talked about as well. So again, we've got secondary independent confirmation that there was a security badge that actually looked like that. His badge number was H6196MAJ. Level 4-5, very important floor. This is the clean sphere floor. And you'll notice that there is an iris. This iris can move out for the clean sphere floor. You've got these orange cables going across the clean sphere, and they are to suspend the quote beehive lights. There was a boardroom on the right side, one boardroom on the left side, and then we've got the actuation of the actual clean sphere floor. So what does this thing actually look like? Before you get into the clean sphere, there's multiple protocols that have to be followed. This is the entire layout of the protocols. The 4-5 gantry vehicle and overview of clean sphere entry protocol. So you've got the totally encapsulated suit that you have to contend with. You have to have a positive pressure environment in that suit and into the clean sphere. Now, detail views. We've got the PINS device. What did Dan Burrish do when he got there? He worked with this PINS device, which is the pressure-induced needle system. He carried a briefcase with him when he got into the airlock, which gained access to the clean sphere. Down here, I've got the representation of the 40-ton Dragon Wagon tank hauler. Shows you how they got the craft to the facility. And this is a rendering of the airlock here. This is a layout of what the 4-5 facility looks like. So picture in your mind's eye a large square building, somewhat similar to what we have here. And on all four corners, you'll have this fillet radius. So the corners aren't sharp, but they're blended really nicely. And then on the lower floor, you've got something called a scissor lift. It's the same type of scissor lift you see in manufacturing, in construction sites. And just above that, of course, we've got a hydraulically actuated scissor lift. There's a floor with a large circular cutout with something called the clean sphere. And the clean sphere, ladies and gentlemen, is not a complete sphere. It's like an orange cut in half, so it's strictly a half of a sphere. That's what we'll be considering here. Here you see the SolidWorks rendering of the clean sphere device, and then the scissor lift, almost identical to what you would see at your, that bring this box up to the 747 cargo bay and then bring in the meals. That's the same type of configuration that you would see at the bottom of 4-5. Here's the rendering of what the clean sphere actually looked like. It was 52 feet across. The plexiglass clear bubble was 2 inches thick. Think about the manufacturing that had to take place to get that there. Just an incredible level of engineering. Impeccable lighting was located on 4-5, which is different than level 4-1. There were 7 indented windows, or Majestic 12 observation gallery windows. They measured 2.5 feet wide, 4.5 feet tall. So there were 7 of those so that you could look down inside the clean sphere as you're taking tissue samples from the J-rod. That's what we see here. Now we've got something called the beehive lights. These beehive lights could actually move along trapeze cables. They could be lowered and raised through a telescopic device, and these were actually designed and built by J-Rods and the S4 engineers. Just an impeccable level of lighting on 4-5. Why is that needed? Because you don't want any shadows when you're taking tissue samples from an extraterrestrial. Here you can see the edge of the 4-5 floor, which is in the yellow and black stripe right here, and then also the edge of the clean sphere bubble right here. That's what we're indicating in this illustration. Now, there's something called kick plates that actually are manually operated, and they seal the gap between the clean sphere edge and the floor of 4-5, the opening. That's what they do. And according to Dan Burrish, these were done by hand manually, and when you slam these down, there's a big bang that takes place. So it's something that he really stressed. Here we see the scissor lift lifting the clean sphere up to the second floor of 4-5. And then you can see again the hydraulically actuated scissor lift. Now, we'll talk about the test or totally enclosed suit. Similar to what you would see in the Gemini, Mercury, even the Apollo program of 1969. It's a positive pressure suit to keep out biocontaminants. That's actually its job. And when Dan Burrish was at 4-5 inside the clean sphere, he was taking upwards of 300 tissue samples from the J-rod because he suffered from a genetic neuropathy defect. And the overall program was to find a cure for that genetic defect. And one way they did that is to use this pressure-induced needle system that Dr. Dan Burrish personally told me was very small. He called it a Saturday night special. And it had a pneumatically actuated hose off the aft end of the pins device. There was a small cartridge that was loaded right inside the shaft here, and you could take the tissue samples that was sent up to the analysis department. So that's how they did that. He also carried a brief. This is a very well done pencil sketch by Mark McCandlish, who is again the world's premier. Dan Burrish being suit and then entering the airlock or decontamination chamber for entry into the clean sphere. Now, what in the world does J-Rod mean? I mean, we've heard this before. In its simplest terms, J-Rod means 15 because J on the computer keyboard is the 10th letter in the English language. The dash or rod symbolic of the Mayan glyph that indicated the number 5. So you put those together, you get 15. That's also symbolic because it shares a same human lineage. A true alien, on the other hand, would bear no such human lineage. So that's the difference between an extraterrestrial and an alien. Now, when he was working there, you can see him with the pins device taking samples from the J-rod. And he was called Kaela, a little bit of description of what he looked like. Disproportionately large head. He had a small nose, long arms, and no teeth. Interesting to note that the designation for this particular J-rod was EBE-53AZ2. That stands for Extraterrestrial Biological Entity, 1953 UFO Crash Retrieval, Kingman, Arizona, number 2. Because remember, the first one died on impact. The other one went to a Y-11 facility at Los Alamos. Now, during one of these tissue sample sessions, remember, you have to follow a certain protocol to approach this J-rod. You have to raise up your right hand, the J-rod raises his right hand, and then you take multiple bride straps together, and then you meet in the center. During one occasion within the clean sphere, the J-rod, who was known as Kaela, he broke the protocol, rushed Dan, and they had developed a friendship at this time. So this had never happened before, and he wasn't under attack, but Dan Burrish was startled about what took place. He stepped back and accidentally caught his boot of the total encapsulated suit on the grid structure of the bottom of floor of 4-5, and he tripped over backwards on his oxygen tank, and the J-rod proceeded to infuse into him a tremendous amount of material having to do with future events. So it's incredible what took place inside the clean sphere. This is an illustration by Mark McCandlish showing the decontamination process within the airlock for entry into the 4-5 facility. Now, again, how did they get this technology to access these naturally occurring stargates? Ladies and gentlemen, they got those from the Sumerian cylinder seals, in some cases from the Baghdad Museum. Now, what you'll do here is you'll take a piece of wet clay and you'll roll that over the clay, the cylinder seal, and you'll end up with this positive relief. Now, according to Dan Bush, what the government figured out how to do is you take a mirror, go right down the center line of one of these glyphs, and you get a mirror image, which is nothing more than a blueprint on how you access these naturally occurring stargates. That's how they did it. That's how they did it. Now, in 2003, something interesting happened. J-Rod was moved from his position within the CleanSphere 4-5 facility. He was flown to Abydos Temple, which is down the Nile River. Perhaps some of you have been there, actually. And remember, he has to be in his own positive pressure atmospheric environment or he'll die. So they ended up building a stroller for him. This is Dr. Dan Burish's illustration of what that stroller actually looked like. And recall, too, that they were friends at the time. So Dan Burish was sad that J-Rod could not go home to his family and be with his family. He had a compassion for him. So in this act of compassion, during the accessing by the government of one of these naturally occurring stargates at Abydos Temple, Dan Burish thrust forward that stroller and pushed Kayla into this stargate, sending him home. However, Dan and the stroller device were kicked out. He got into a lot of trouble for this, but it was an act of compassion on Dr. Dan Burish. There was a very interesting piece of nostalgia at the end of Groom Lake Runway, according to Dan Burish. There is a sign there that has multiple arrows pointing in every direction, and the sign says home. And this is a symbolic message that what takes place at S4, perhaps Groom Lake, home is underground, it's in outer space, it's north, it's east, it's west, home is everywhere. There's a symbolic encrypted message being employed in this symbol here. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think it's really important that we honor the courage that Dan Burish had to come forward and give us this information regarding the specific details of the S4 facility and providing all of us a potential for a very bright future, which is on the nearby horizon. And I want to thank you for your attention.
We want to thank Open Minds TV for submitting their amazing video right here at Third Phase of Moon. And if you captured anything amazing in regards to UFOs, you could contact us via Skype or Facebook. My name's Blake Cousins, and we'll see you again next time.
Like say angels and aliens or things, it's like if you're open to it, I think you're more likely to see things like that than if you're closed-minded and they would scare you or something. But I wasn't scared, it was freaky. What do you think of that, fella?
He's right, and I think that you bring up a good point. If you're open to it, you're kind of inviting it in. If you're open to it, it sounds like an interesting story.
We may take it on. These dudes in cigarettes.
Our second speaker for today is a private pilot, a military aerospace historian, has lectured across the USA on the unique subject of mystery aircraft and classified propulsion systems buried deep within the military-industrial complex. He has presented evidence that supports the claim that elements within the military-industrial complex, specifically then the American aerospace industry, have designed, built, and test, saucer-shaped aircraft which mimic the form, fit, and function of what we perceive to be extraterrestrial UFOs. So the question is, does this technology now exist actually to take ET home? Well, he's done a lot to dig out information about the black budget, off-black budget, special access programs that have laid the financial groundwork for those who have been developing secret aerospace mega projects. This material is really interesting. It's, kind of fills some of the missing gaps between what we know exists and what is speculation as well. So this will really kind of help to solidify the subject as well that we heard so much about from Mark. So it's going to be really interesting. He's going to talk to us about the man-made versus ET issue. So give a big round of applause for Michael Schratt.
Well, good morning, everyone. I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to join all of you today. What I'd like to do for you today is give you a brief overview of some of the classified aircraft that have been developed within the military-industrial complex. I want to talk about some aircraft that might be considered UFOs, but may actually be man-made craft. I want to discuss the black budget, and then I also want to talk about some crash retrievals. But really, I want to have some fun with this presentation, and we've got quite a bit of material to go over here. I thought I'd begin with this interesting entry that was put into a book published in 2007 called the Reagan Diaries. And here on page 334, this is Reagan speaking to. It says, "Lunch with 5 top scientists. It was fascinating. Space truly is the last frontier. And some of the developments there in astronomy are like science fiction, except they are real. I learned that our shuttle capacity is such that we could orbit 300 people. So I want to ask all of you today, the shuttle only holds 8 astronauts. How does Reagan get this 300 people going into the shuttle system? How could this possibly be true?" Then we've got some interesting statements made by Neil Armstrong. It says, this is July 20th, 1994 at the White House. "There are great ideas undiscovered, breakthroughs available to those that can remove one of truth's protective layers. There are places to go beyond belief." Neil Armstrong, 25th anniversary of the Apollo moon landing. Then we have Above Top Secret by Timothy Good. Interesting statement here, a transaction between a scientist of an MI6 individual and Neil Armstrong. And this is page 186, so I'm not just making this up. "Professor, what really happened there on Apollo 11? Armstrong, it was incredible, of course. We'd always known there was a possibility. The fact is, we were warned off. There was never any question then of a space station or a moon city." "Professor, how do you mean warned off?" Armstrong, "I can't go into details except to say that their ships were far superior to ours, both in size and technology. Boy, they were big and menacing. No, there is no question of a space station." So again, this is page 186 of Timothy Good's Above Top Secret. So it turns out, ladies and gentlemen, that there are in point of fact 2 space programs, one in the form of a public relations smokescreen organization known as NASA. The other one is called U.S. Air Force Space Command, also known as Solar Warden, and that comes from Paul E. Violette and the Huffington Post, 12/7/2012. Here's another question we need to look at too. Did the Rockwell Star Raker go operational? Is this what Ronald Reagan was talking about when he talked about the capability of orbiting 300 people? Obviously, he wasn't talking about putting those people into the shuttle cargo bay. This was a proposal for a 1979 single stage to orbit, high lift wing orbital launch vehicle, 310-foot length, 360-foot wingspan, capacity of 200,000 pounds for the cargo, and it was powered by 10 high bypass turbofan ramjets, 3 liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen rocket engines. So this could have been something that we as the general public were never clued in on, but Reagan may have actually been given a briefing. A couple of quick announcements here. The visual aids used in this presentation are computer-generated forensic composite illustrations based off the actual UFO case files and military defense trade publications. Source material was QFOS, NICAP, the APRO archives, Aviation Week Space Technology, Jane's Defense Weekly, Invisible Residents by Ivan T. Sanderson, which I highly recommend. Uninvited Guest by Richard Hall, Magic Eyes Only, UFO News Clipper Service, Wendell Stevens Archives, and the Leonard Springfield Collection. I kind of want to start right here, and you might be thinking, why in the world am I showing a picture of a Dorito here? What does a Dorito have to do with a secret space program? Well, back in 1984, this configuration was the most classified configuration that you'd ever want to see. In point of fact, this configuration was so classified, engineers working on the program associated with that configuration were forbidden to bring in a bag of Doritos out of fear that the configuration of this aircraft might be revealed. That's how secret this was. This is the A-12 Avenger II, also known as the Flying Dorito. This was a joint McDonnell Douglas General Dynamics program designed to replace the A-6 Intruder as an all-weather attack aircraft. Procurement funding for this was $4.78 billion of your tax dollars went into a full-scale research development contract for General Dynamics McDonnell Douglas. McDonnell Douglas was brought onto the contract because of their experience with naval carrier-based aircraft. That's why McDonnell Douglas was actually brought on. Now, we were going to buy, the Navy was going to buy 620 of these aircraft. Again, this is what we've got to show for it here with this Dorito here. But this is the full-scale mock-up that was made. And this is all we have to show for our $4.878 billion, because it was on January the 7th of 1991 that Dick Cheney canceled this program and cost us all $5 billion. So I've been looking for about a decade now, trying to track where our money disappeared to. Since we as taxpayers have funded this program, we own these type programs. We have every right to question authority, and this is something that we really should keep in mind. Different publications, Los Angeles Times, New York Times, Washington Post, they talk about $57 billion jet for Navy is canceled, citing cost overruns. Cheney kills Navy attack plane, stealth jet for Navy is canceled. So I want to give you something to hang your hat on here. According to C-SPAN, and I've got all the dates here so you can verify this for yourself, they said, quote, over 3 million pounds of material have been cut on the A-12 Avenger II program. That was July 24th, 1991. So you've got all this material, all these hardware, all these tooling type things. Where did all this go? What do we have to show for our $5 billion? Since Lockheed Martin bought the General Dynamics Aeronautical Division, your point of contact is a woman by the name of Karen Hagar. She's the public affairs person. And by all means, please ask her where your $5 billion portion went. I've included her email address. Her telephone number is 817-763-4085. Okay? Please ask her where your $5 billion went. I mean, it's unbelievable. It's so highly secretive that I said, come on, guys, can't you guys even give me a washer from the program? Just give me a washer. They wouldn't even do that. So I commissioned our good friend Mark McCandlish. I said, Mark, these guys are going to play it like this. Would you please put together an illustration depicting what the A-12 Avenger II would look like on the assembly line? And this is what we came up with. And it's a really good drawing by Mark McCandlish. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I believe that this is probably the closest we're ever going to see regarding the A-12 Avenger II program. However, there may actually be more to this story than meets the eye. There might be something secret going on with the A-12 Avenger II. This is a letter written to a colleague of mine by the name of Lee Graham. This is from Armin Victorian, date December 30th, 1992. I want to bring your attention to this bottom section down here. And he says, Section A, Navy's A-12 prototype was completed and flown by Lockheed. Completed and flown by Lockheed. Okay. 2 other sources have confirmed from General Dynamics that right around 1990, Lockheed basically picked up the pieces of the A-12 Avenger II program from General Dynamics. They've confirmed that there were, in point of fact, 2 assembly lines running at General Dynamics. One was the Navy version, which was canceled by Dick Cheney, January 7th, 1991. And there was a secret Air Force version of this aircraft. Now, when Ben Rich, who was the head of the Skunk Works between 1975 and 1991, when his team at the Skunk Works took a look at this edge here, they noticed that a single straight edge was very bad for radar cross-section. So Lockheed Skunk Works engineers designed a notch into the trailing edge. They also clipped the wingtips to reduce the radar cross-section. and that is the AX-12 Air Force version of the A-12 Avenger II, which is completely black. Now, back in 2000, a 1/3 scaled up version of this aircraft, which is used as a stealthy troop insertion aircraft, was actually built by Lockheed. It's between the F-117 in size and the B-2. So there's this interim aircraft between those two aircraft. That aircraft was sighted over Amarillo, Texas by multiple eyewitnesses. And then in last month, I was with Steve Douglas, who's another aircraft researcher, and we were at this exhibit here. This is a very interesting hangar complex that they have on the other side of the tarmac, and he brought his radio with him, and he overheard the term Little Area 51 at Cannon Air Force Base. So it appears that there's a smaller version of Area 51 at Cannon Air Force Base. Now we've got the Boeing Phantom Works bird of prey. This was declassified October 2002 under the Bush administration. $67 million procurement funding from Boeing on this particular program. It made 38 test flights between 1992 and 1999. Basically, this aircraft was the first aircraft to use low observable stealth technology for one-piece solid construction, and it also had 3D virtual reality design and assembly processes involved with this aircraft. Procurement funding, again, is $67 million. It was 47 feet long, 23-foot wingspan. Important point to keep in mind on the Boeing Phantom Works bird of prey is that when you have a proprietary program, it is exempt from FOIA requests. So you can't get anything else on the Boeing Phantom Works bird of prey. This is one of those proprietary programs. Another drawing done by Mark McCandlish, talking about the Sneaky Pete, also the Have Blue prototype, and then Boeing Phantom Works bird of prey. Detroit Free Press, secret ledger hides military projects. Pentagon black budget has tripled under Reagan administration. So I want to quote my sources, Detroit Free Press, February 8th, 19 In 1981, the black budget grew by just over $500 million. Now, by 1988, that figure rose to nearly $9.122 billion. So you can see there's this exponential growth in the black budget. Federal spending by category, procurement spending for agriculture was $26 billion. Transportation was $28 billion. But the Pentagon's black budget for fiscal year 1988 was $35 billion. So they're spending more on black budget programs than they are for education. So is there a mismanagement of funding here? Do we have bridges breaking? Do we have schools falling apart? That money could be put into other programs. Total spending for procurement funding of the Air Force for 80 was in the black budget. Okay, now in this article, they have two things to keep in mind here. It says Thomas Amley, a Pentagon missile expert with security clearances high enough to know about some black programs, said the military has three basic reasons for having them. One, you're doing something that should genuinely be secret. Two, you're doing something so damn stupid you don't want anyone to know about it. And three, you want to rip open the money bag and get out a shovel because there's no accountability. So when you talk about black programs, there's no public scrutiny, no congressional oversight. Second one here, it says, in a black project, people don't worry about money, said a 31-year-old systems engineer projects at the Space Systems Division of Lockheed Missiles and Space Company in Sunnyvale, California. Here's what he said. If you need money, you got it. If you screw up and you need more, you got it, said the engineer, who asked that his name not be published. You're just pouring money into this thing until you get it right. There's no incentive to do it right the first time. Who's going to question it? So you can see the mentality of what we're really up against here. Aviation Week, Space Technology, December 24th, 1990, summed it up really well. 8 years of the Reagan administration were very good to the black world. Really sums it up nicely. Now, how do you get this information? Where do you go to track the black budget? It turns out every January 27th of every year, a public relations program in the form of this document, which is available to the general public, is called RDT&E Programs R1. That stands for Research, Development, Test, and Evaluation Programs R1. You can pick this up at the Library of Congress. And in this document, they list programs that are within the Department of Defense. Over here, you've got the line items, and then you've got how much was spent. But when it comes to classified programs, they don't tell you anything about it. For instance, senior year operations, forest green operations, no technical details, no information regarding how much procurement funding was done on the program. So what you end up doing here is you take the total amount and you subtract the knowns, and what you're left with are the unknowns or the black programs. Now, how can we verify this? Defense Daily, July 14th, 1988, also had their procurement funding. And you can see here, Theme Castle, no information, just a code name. Senior Citizen, we've got Omega. It's a black program. We don't know the details. So again, you take the total amount, subtract the knowns. What you're left with are the unknowns. This is an interesting publication, 1970, establishment, and the no-holds-barred type of logic it uses to justify its zillion-dollar existence. These programs have gone rogue, no congressional oversight. A couple of quick code names I want to bring to your attention here. This comes from John Andrews, who's the senior project design engineer at Testers Model Corporation in San Diego. He was tracking these black budget fundings, and he wrote this FOIA request to the DoD, and a couple of things we want to look at here. Rosetta, classified program. Housekeeping, what's housekeeping? Redbird, and then the two final ones, 4 and 5, Rainbow, and something called Snowbird, which we really want to get into. Groom for secrecy, Groom Lake toxic burning alleged. Las Vegas Review-Journal, March 20th, 1992. They really did a good job on this article. Basically what they're saying is, during the stealth program, vintage 1981 to right around 1988, according to this article, Burbank Lockheed Skunk Works Division was basically trying to get rid of all their toxic chemicals, solvents, resins, and they put these in 55-gallon drums. And twice a week on Mondays and Wednesdays, an 18-wheeler tractor trailer truck hired by a foreign company called NDB would drive all the way from Burbank Skunk Works to Area 51. They'd follow this perimeter road. They'd go past the residential area, and then these 300-foot-long burning pits dump these 55-gallon drums into these burn pits and throw jet fuel on it and ignite the whole thing. So I ask all of you, is it any wonder that our Area 51 engineers are dying of cancer when you've got this acrid, toxic smoke burning and flowing right over the residential area? So I'm zooming in to Area 51. That's the world's largest runway. You could put one space shuttle landing on either side and still have 5,000 feet between the two aircraft. And then I'm going to zoom into this area. The hangar surface area on the bottom here are what's known as the Red Hat hangars for the Soviet MiGs. Before that, they were the A-12 hangars. Just in back of the Red Hat hangars are what's known as the U-2 spy plane hangars. That's where final assembly was made for the U-2. We've also got the residential area, and then up here on the corner, we've got the area where it shows the burn pits right in here. So that's what we want to focus in on. Here's a 1968 photo of Area 51 showing the residential. Ask all of you, this is something we really should answer. Who is the idiot within the Air Force, Department of Defense, EPA, that allowed them to do this right next to the residential? I mean, talk about lack of planning. It's just horrible. They had a sidebar article within this Las Vegas Review-Journal that I really want to talk about here. And it's talking about the bar that was at Area 51 called Sam's Place. And this is what they talked about from one who was actually there. Extravagant living on a secret base. So this is your tax dollars at work here. A favorite watering hole was Building 170, the hangar-sized centerpiece of the base's recreational complex. It is listed in one base directory as Sam's Place, a bar named after a Central Intelligence Agency official who once ran the base, said a source involved in base operations during the 1980s. Sam's Place was a dark, fully carpeted nightclub with large padded chairs and a bar ring with stools that rivaled the largest ones in Las Vegas, the source said. The club had 4 pool tables, dartboards, and a big screen. The recreational complex was complete with an 8-lane bowling alley, a heated indoor pool, 4 racquetball courts, a basketball gymnasium with a wooden floor, tennis courts, saunas, and a snack bar. At one time, a golf course and lighted softball field existed as well. Supplies for the base were flown in from Hill Air Force Base in Utah aboard C-130s. Sometimes people would chip in and buy big ice boxes of shrimp that were enough to offload the shrimp. And then the final one here, some colonels, he said, had very extravagant tastes, including one who had grapefruits flown in from Israel at $25 a piece and requested deliveries of canned tuna from South America that he estimated cost the government $26 per can. So here's your tax dollars at work with these big guys over here at Area 51. Another drawing by Mark McCandlish. This is the McDonnell Douglas Manta Ray. 18 of these aircraft were built by Desert Storm. They flew along with the F-117s as a digital real-time intelligence gathering aircraft, specifically photographic type aircraft. It was also carrier capable. It had a interesting arresting hook and also a launch contraption in the front for carrier-based operations. Very low rate. That had twin canted vertical stabilizers that you can see here. Orders of magnitude lower RCS than the F-117. Something called the Flying Artichoke has been sighted at Air Force Plant 42 in Holloman Air Force Base. It has a crew of 2, pilot and a weapons system operator. It has a very interesting tail arrangement here with a porous aft section that absorbs sound. It's capable of carrying 6 2,000-pound laser-guided weapons. So this is the Flying Artichoke. Now, right around 1989, we started hearing these reports of something called the Aurora. That's definitely not the code name that's actually used, but that's a catch-all phrase, really. And on August 1989, Chris Gibson, who was an offshore oil drilling platform operator, he noticed a KC-135 flying overhead that was flanked on the left side by 2 F-111s that had their wings extended. And then directly behind the KC-135, there was a black triangle that had a 75-degree swept wing configuration that he could not identify. And he was a member of the Royal Naval Observers Corps. So if there's anyone who couldn't identify it, who should have, it would have been Chris Gibson, because he's very well versed in identifying aircraft in less than 1 second. So we've reversed the image to show you what this actually could have looked like. This remains today, even today, a classified program. Now, if you look in the Boeing archives, you'll see this motif, this legacy of development regarding 75-degree swept wing configurations for hypersonic aircraft. This may be a configuration that Chris Gibson actually got to see. Another drawing by Mark McCandlish. Interesting backstory on this aircraft. When the colonel who first laid his eyes on this particular configuration, when he saw it for the first time, he said that that was an elegant lady. And so that name has stuck with this particular aircraft. It is a 2-stage-to-orbit space plane consisting of a mothership and a parasitic aircraft that's launched from the spine of the mothership. Each of these wingtips is estimated to be about 16 feet, called a launch control officer. He is the liaison between the mothership and the parasitic aircraft, and he sits aft in the last seat here. It has 2 canards that can retract for high-speed flight. It's powered by either 4 combined cycle pulse detonation wave engines, or as Mark mentioned, the scramjets too. Now, what evidence do we have for this? Aviation Week Space Technology, August 24th, 1992, talks about eyewitnesses who saw this in the Antelope Valley, Lancaster, Palmdale area. So we've got some good sightings there. This is the model called the SR-75 Penetrator that was done by John Andrews, who again is the Senior Project Design Engineer Testers Model Corporation in San Diego. And we believe that the mothership configuration here is about 85% correct. This parasitic aircraft that he has here has the correct wing sweep angle, but the configuration of where the engines are, we don't believe that that is correct. This is a photograph of John Andrews. So if there was any question about this gentleman's integrity, it was never challenged, because he was a gentleman until he passed away in 1999. His veracity was never questioned. So you can hang your hat basically on information provided by John Andrews. A good scale model of what this looked like. Interesting thing, people who have seen this said that the configuration and color of this aircraft was kind of a light white or gray configuration with a blacked leading edge. And then the air intakes on this aircraft were diagonally cut at 45 degrees. And they said that people who saw this particular aircraft take off said that the air intakes were so large that you could drive a Volkswagen right into them. So we're talking large air intakes. John McNeil put this together, shows you the two-stage orbit spaceplane system. Again, you can see the air intakes in this location and these large winglets. This is a top view looking down, shows you the scale of this aircraft here. And then we believe that this aircraft is not called Aurora, but in point of fact, either Senior Year or Senior Smart. That's believed to be the code name for this particular aircraft. Now, one other propulsion system that may be associated with the mothership of this aircraft is something that Mark T. Constantine, who was the Aerojet Tech Systems Division Manager, this is 1985, he gave a lecture. Here is one propulsion system that may be associated with that two-stage orbit spaceplane system. Here's what he said. The Air Turbo Ramjet, or ATR, is a combined cycle air-breathing engine which we commonly refer to as cold turbine technology. By combining the rocket engine and air-breathing engine technologies, the ATR can achieve static thrust-to-weight capability in excess of that available from our most advanced turbojet and turbofan engines. The ATR continues to produce thrust as Mach number increases, which enables acceleration to more optimal cruise altitudes of 90 to 120,000 feet at Mach 5. So this is exactly the kind of speed range we're talking about here. But then there's a question that comes up, this strange anomaly that comes up. This took place May 30th, 1991. John Andrews, who we mentioned before, put in a telephone call to Ben Rich. And this is something that Ben Rich volunteered. He wasn't prodded by John. This is something that Ben Rich came up with. This was published in the 1993 OFNI World Almanac. So I want to give you the source of where this came from. The Spanish translation to English here is, if I were to use the word snowbird, I would be in jail. If I were to use the word snowbird, I would be so unacknowledged that Ben Rich would get thrown in jail for even using. In 1982, Pratt & Whitney, who has a long history with Lockheed because they developed the J-58 that powered the SR-71, they developed something called a magnetohydrodynamic drive, also known as an MHD. A couple of quick points. Utilizes electric and magnetic fields. So this is not an engine, ladies and gentlemen. This is a drive system. There's no moving parts. It probably is the propulsion system for Snowbird, developed by Pratt & Whitney in 1982. Speeds above Mach 20. So that's way out there in the speed regime. Hypersonic Aurora, what could this thing actually look like that uses the MHD drive? Something that Jane's Defense Weekly, December 12th, 1992, had a really good article about the configuration. Again, we see this 75-degree swept wing configuration. So there's this motif that's going through the 1960s all the way up to the 1992 article here. Now, Wizard of Oz, Somewhere Over the Rainbow. Is this... is there more going on here? Somewhere Over the Rainbow. This is the song that Dorothy sang in this very popular movie. Is there something more going on here, or is this just from Robert Jameson to John Andrews, February 28th, 1994? Here's what he said. It says, he was a military monitor. On 367.7, I overheard a conversation between a KC-135 tanker at 47,000 feet calling Rainbow 1 that they were on station. Approximately 7 minutes later, Rainbow 1 called quote-unquote Big Boy for a fill-up. The tanker returned the call but said if you would turn on your lights, it would be easier to find you. Rainbow 1 told the tanker to go to Secure Channel G, end of transmission. So, if the Aurora is launched over west of Hawaii, is that where we get the term Somewhere Over the Rainbow? If Rainbow is the mothership aircraft, it's a possibility. Aviation Week Space Technology, November 11th, 1991. We're not going to read the whole thing, but just the top here. 2 unusually loud sonic booms heard along the west coast from San Diego to North Las Vegas, Angeles, may have been producing high-flying classified aircraft returning test ranges in Nevada. So they were talking about airquakes, not earthquakes, but airquakes. So I actually contacted Caltech and I said, can you give me your data for October 31st, 1991? And this is the actual result. They call it a sonic. At the exact same time this aircraft flew over, it triggered all these instruments from Caltech and the Geologic Institute. So, ladies and gentlemen, I believe this might be one of the most conclusive pieces of evidence for a quote-unquote Aurora aircraft. Now, the most important thing to keep in mind here is that these airquakes, these aircraft flying over Catalina Island, going over downtown Los Angeles, always occurred on a Thursday morning. A Thursday morning at like 6:58 a.m., 7:05 a.m., repeatedly on the last Thursday of the month during 1991 and 1992. Always on a Thursday. Why a Thursday? Because in the black world, Area 51, Air Force Plant 42, Thursday is the test flight, Friday is the debrief, Saturday and Sunday, there's no one there. And so that's why Thursdays are very apparent in the black world. This is an article, paper that was received by Lee Graham from the United States Department of Interior. It says, Dear Mr. Graham, in response to your letter of 31/1992, please find enclosed a copy of data recorded by a seismograph at Catalina Island for the sonic boom of January 30th, 1992. So if you look at what's done here, here's what he says. Last Thursday of the month, Thursday, October 31st, 1991, and remember, these tick marks are 1 minute apart. So boom, right? This is your Aurora returning from an overseas mission. Now, about a minute later, another boom right here. So you might think, oh, that's that mothership, right? Returning along with it. The mothership isn't even back yet. It doesn't even fly the same pattern. So this might be either an F-16 or an F-15 flying as a safety chase aircraft. So it's not the mothership flying with the parasitic aircraft. Again, Thursday, June 27th, 1991, last Thursday of the month, boom. About a minute later, another boom. So this day, November 21st, 1991, we have another boom here. Bingo! It must be an American bird. They didn't want to work on Thanksgiving Day. So this time, it wasn't on the last Thursday of the month. It was the week prior. So you know, ladies and gentlemen, this is one of ours. There's no doubt about it. There's no doubt about it. Catalina Island, Thursday, January 30th, 1992, 7:17 a.m., another boom. And then about a minute and a half later, number two. So you can parasitic aircraft flying over Catalina Island. It wakes everybody up in the morning in Los Angeles, and then a chase plane follows it. Here's the track, returning to Area 51, going over Catalina Island, Los Angeles, waking everybody up, then heading north of Edwards Air Force Base, going into Tonopah Test Range, and then into Area 51. So I want to give you kind of a brief cross-section of what their flight pattern looks like. Again, Catalina Island, Thursday, April 16th, 1992, 6:58 a.m. Always on a Thursday, always on a Thursday. Mount Wilson, April 16th, 1992, Thursday, 7:02, another one. It just goes on and on. The evidence is overwhelming. Okay, so here is a typical snowbird mission profile flight path. This came from Jim Goodall. I asked Jim, I said, Jim, what's the flight path of these aircraft? And so he said, this is Jim Goodall's interpretation of what these aircraft may be flying. He believes, ladies and gentlemen, that this is a nuclear proliferation monitoring aircraft, because at the fall of the Soviet Union, they had to figure out a way to monitor all this fissionable material that was kind of loose within the former Soviet Union. So he believes it's a nuclear proliferation monitoring aircraft. So what you do here is you start at Area 51. You take off from Area 51. You take up a magnetic heading of 310 degrees. You fly over Alaska. At this point here, you're still with the mothership. You're at about 30,000 feet of Mach 1.7. It's at this point you launch from the mothership. You pour the coals to it right here. You go over Russia. You make a 90-degree left-hand turn. You start heading south. You're over Turkey. You're over Israel, right in this area right here. Once you get down here, you make another turn. Now you pour the coals to it right here. You're heading back. At this point, you're over here. Now you're near Hawaii. You're starting to make a... So that may be the mission profile of what these aircraft are actually following. Now, this is something I got from the John Andrews collection, which I was fortunate enough to acquire. This is 14th August 1981. Letter to Ben Rich, former head of Lockheed Skunk Works between 1975 and 1991. It says, Ben Rich, your crew responsible for two very strange birds leaving at dawn just at first light from George Air Force Base. One white, one gray, said to be very Lippish-like. Good acceleration, good climb. Don't loiter around George and not seen for the rest of the day. So John included a sketch of something that may have departed George Air Force Base, August 1981. Now, turns out that there's some very good information from Bill Scott, who is the former Rocky Mountain editor of Aviation Week Space Technology. This is March 6, 2006, talking about a program called Black Star. It appears, ladies and gentlemen, that there are two versions of this technology. There's one called Black Star, which is airdrop from the belly of the craft. So that's the different kind of configurations that are used. This is a Steve Douglas illustration by Boeing, and they include a parasitic aircraft up inside an indented section under the belly of the mothership. So we've got patents to back this up. We've got eyewitnesses reported to Pete Ames from John Andrews. It says 22nd February 1994. The place, Kadena Air Force Base. The time, the weekend of 13th February 1994. It says, emergency call from manned aircraft to expedite recovery at Kadena Air Force Base, coming from north, tracked speed at Mach 4.2. Diversions for other aircraft in area. Aircraft recovered and quickly placed in secure hangar. Red 3 lockdown declared by base. Other pilots landing kept and slept in ready quarters. One white-gray C-5 launched from Holloman Air Force Base. 3-day lockdown at base. So something made an emergency landing at Kadena Air Force Base. And this is the configuration per the Bill Scott article. They also mentioned that there was a solid rocket booster that is loaded into the aft end of this vehicle. So we're definitely talking at least Mach 4.2 for this particular configuration. The truth is out. Air Forces Monthly, March 1997, September 26, 1994, was the date of an event that has never been talked about in American press. I had to get an overseas publication for this. And the details regarding this case was a top secret aircraft believed to have been a classified variant of the YF-23 by Northrop. Had a crew of 2. On the application of military power, somehow the landing gear collapsed right up here on the nose gear, and this thing kind of ground to a halt. The pilots were fine. They had to tow it back to a hangar. It stayed in that hangar for 2 nights, and it had a tarp over the midsection. The aft section and the forward section was still exposed, so people could see what this thing actually looked like. On the 3rd day, a C-5 Galaxy was flown into RAF Boscombe Down. This is where this took place. And as they were departing, air traffic controllers and monitoring public on the ground overheard the transmission that this C-5 Galaxy was going to KPMD. So anyone who knows what KPMD is, that's Palmdale. That's the identifier for Palmdale. They were flying back to Palmdale. This is the configuration of what we actually believe this aircraft looks like. It was a variant of the YF-23 2-seat aircraft with 2 inward canted vertical stabilizers, other than the YF-23 version that has 2 outward canted vertical stabilizers. So we get to the B-2 stealth bomber. $2.3 billion per aircraft, more than its own weight in gold. That's what we're talking about here. 21 of these aircraft were built. Tremendous amount of money. I call this the $10 billion photograph because we've got 4 B-2s at the Pico Rivera plant. 2.3, that's about $10 billion right there. And it's 172 going on to the B-2 that meets the eye. Aviation Week Space Technology, March 9th, 1992, had a very interesting article from people who worked at Northrop who were very upset that the technology associated with the B-2 program was not being trickled down to the public industry. They talk about how the B-2 electrically charges the leading edge of the wing to reduce the radar cross signature. That's what you see in this diagram right here. And then negatively charges the exhaust gases to reduce the infrared signature. This is the same type electrogravitic technology that T. Townsend Brown had originally proposed in the 1930s. So this technology might date back a lot earlier than we originally thought. The proof about this comes from Electrogravitic Systems by Thomas Falone, so you can back that up. And then I recently came across some information from a General Dynamics engineer who had previously worked in the black world. And basically he said, you know, I'm done with the black world. I've been there. I'm through with it. I'm now a biker. So he left the black world behind. And he said that according to this particular General Dynamics engineer who worked on the B2 program, he said that for every 3 B2s that are built, for every turns out that there's 7 anti-gravity versions. General Dynamics engineer. Now, September 1967, a naval combat veteran by the name of Jack Pickett, who I was really good friends with, he's no longer with us. He claims that during September 1967, he was at MacDill Air Force Base, which is in Tampa, and they got to this area right here, which is called the base scrapyard. And when he got there, he looked over the chain link fence and saw 4 of the most incredible aircraft that he had ever seen in his entire life. Just an incredible configuration. They measured 20, 40, 70. The largest one was 116 feet in diameter. They all had the same configuration, but different sizes. They had tricycle landing gear. There was an air intake on both sides of the pilot's compartment. And then this very huge vertical tail that tapered back to the pilot's compartment. This is the long-range bomber version of this aircraft. According to Jack, he was told that this was used as a long-range reconnaissance bomber during the Cold War. And so he asked a lot of questions from the general who was over at MacDill Air Force Base and inquired about putting together an article for the base publication newsletter. He was given authorization to write that article, which was titled Flying Saucers for Real, and then he was given 16 officially stamped black and white glossy photographs of these aircraft parked on the tarmac, in flight, also with F-86 jet fighter interceptors, F-84 jet fighter interceptors as well, and had a tremendous amount of, but then it turns out just before going to press of a VTOL, vertical takeoff and landing version of this aircraft, which rolls down the runway, this is a horizontal takeoff bird, that particular aircraft suffered a propulsion system malfunction, dropped down to treetop level, so directly over Miami at high speed, woke everyone up. The next morning it was all over the newspapers, all over the news. And so he brought that newspaper into the general's office the next morning and said, General, I think we've got a problem here because I'm getting ready to declassify and release this jet-powered disc that you have at the scrapyard, but then you're denying the existence of this aircraft that flew over downtown Miami. What do you guys want to do about it? So that general contacted Offutt Air Force Base, contacted the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of the Air Force. And according to the Secretary of the Air Force, it would be in the better interest of the Air Force to delay publication. And that's where this story died back in 1967. So we were within hours of getting the truth about one of our classified programs brought into the public domain within hours, but then it was canceled. So now we want to move on to flying triangles. November 29th, 1989, Belgium was seen. January 5th, 2000, Southern Illinois, Area 51, Groom Lake. They've been seen almost in every country by every possible culture. So it's a worldwide phenomenon. We've got a case over here, kind of the overall view of what we see. 99, Kirby, a very significant sighting. And if anyone in this room is a skeptic, I just invite you to look at this gentleman's testimony. Colin Saunders, you can Google him. He gave a really nice 20-minute lecture regarding this particular sighting. A very honest gentleman. I totally believe his case. He was with his family driving home at around 9:50 p.m. after dinner when they came across this particular craft. He saw the aft end of it first. It was tilted up at about 15-degree angle of attack on the left-hand side. And then he said the bottom of this craft tipped up, but it tipped up from the back end. And he said, he used the term that it looked like it was submerged underwater. That's how this actually moved underwater. Here's the view of what it looked like from the aft end. He said it was totally silent. And then he said it had these very interesting raised box sections on the top of the craft. The exterior pictorial version of the exterior of the craft looked like a flowing liquid mercury. It was almost alive. And he said that it was his belief that these extruded sections here were part of a docking mechanism with a larger craft. So as this thing flew over, he could see the bottom of it. It also had these raised sections as well. And then as this thing flew over, you can see the forward section right here. It disappeared from view, but then way off into the far horizon, there was a much larger ship that had a red light on one side and a green light on the other side. And he said that this particular aircraft appeared to be trying to dock with that larger craft. So that may be the reason for these interesting raised sections here. This thing was approximately 50 feet across in conjunction with the Cessna 172 that has a 27-foot wingspan. Here's Colin Sanders here. Here's his UFO model. And when I saw that UFO model, I said, wow, I want to have one of those. So I took his technical blueprint, and then in AutoCAD, I put together this schematic drawing here, which is a cardboard stock model. And I produced this for each and every one of you. So you can have a black and white version of this. So you can build your own UFO at home, which is an actual authenticated case. This is what the model looks like right here. This is what the bottom of it looks like right here. It's northwest of Madison, Wisconsin. Very interesting case because of this interesting tube section on the bottom of this aircraft. But we don't only have the illustration. We've got the eyewitness testimony. It says the underside of the craft resembled, quote, the back of a refrigerator, like a collection of condensation pipes that ran back and forth. So keep that in mind, kind of, as we hear. I asked the question, is that what you would expect to see on the bottom of an alien spacecraft? I mean, really, I thought you aliens were 100 million light years ahead of us, and yet you're flying around in these vehicles that look like the back of a refrigerator? Someone's lying to you, folks. Someone's lying to you. I can assure you that. January 5th, 2000, this was the first mass sighting of triangular aircraft after the year 2000, seen by at least 4 police officers, seen by a miniature golf owner who said that this craft looked like a 2-story ranch fly right over his golf course. Very well documented case, another case for skeptics that might be sitting on the fence. Please examine the January 5th, 2000 overflight of southern Illinois by these triangular shaped craft. Some of these had a red and green section in the aft portion, always these white lights at each of the corners, and then an amber or red light below the belly of the craft. Newspaper clipping service picked this up. It was seen over DuPont County, multiple counties within southern Illinois, not too far from St. Louis. May 23rd, 2001, Allen Park, Michigan. This gentleman saw this craft fly over his taxi, actually, blocked out the stars as it flew over. April 3rd through the 5th, 1975, Lumberton, North Carolina. This craft was seen by multiple police officers. It had an interesting cutout notch section in the back end of the triangle, red lights along the leading section here, and then a high-intensity white light that was shining down a beam onto the ground, seen by multiple eyewitnesses. This is the cutout that we see throughout these different craft. Now, this is a very interesting case that I got from David Marler, who is the premier researcher in triangular UFOs. We don't have a date, but we know the location was Oregon. According to this eyewitness, this particular craft is in this location here. According to the eyewitness, this particular craft parked itself, hovered about 20 feet above the river, the Little Pudding River in Oregon. And then it started dropping down this 8 to 10 foot diameter metallic tube, went right into the river, started sucking up this water. And then he noticed that right next to this tube, water was coming out too. So the water's going up, water's coming down. And then he said there was a blue beam of light that exited off the left end of the craft. And then he said something very interesting. There was lights pulsating across the, he called them overflow valves because water was shooting out of these overflow valves. And then there were 3 orange orbs that popped out of the bottom of this thing. About 2 minutes later, after this had completed whatever it was doing, he said it sounded like a washer machine. These orbs merged back into the craft. This craft slowly took off, and then when it reached about an enormous turbine blade UFO, January 21st, 1997, Puerto Rico, also came from the David Marler files. Basically, a primary eyewitness saw this particular craft hover near his location. Now, if you look at the size, he estimates between 500 and 800 feet across. We're talking a massive ship here. Multicolored lights along the leading portion of the vehicle. Then he said it had this section on the bottom that had these rotating turbine blades. But it was his impression that these turbine blades were rotating far too low to support this vehicle. So there's no way it could be the primary source of propulsion, according to the eyewitness. He also said that there was a strange being that had a pear-shaped head on a transparent cupola or dome section of this aircraft. 2 minutes after observing this aircraft, a black 4x4 vehicle pulled up right next to him. A security agent got out of that vehicle, started questioning about this particular craft. No sooner did that security agent start interrogating the primary eyewitness, 2 identical craft to this first one popped out of the clouds and started following this original craft. This craft at that point started introducing it was kind of like a smoky blue glow around this vehicle, and then this thing took off. The other ones were trying to chase after it, but they couldn't get it. So this is January 1st, 1997. Another case from the David Marler files. I put together an illustration here. August 25th, 1990, Barnsley, England. Primary eyewitness and his wife were returning from a Fleetwood Mac concert at night when, out of nowhere, coming this strange triangular-shaped craft that he estimated between 100 and 200 feet across emerged from a dark, misty cloud directly below the cloud bank. And he said he saw it long enough, 30 seconds, long enough to get some really good details. It had one light on each terminating point of the triangle, one light on the bottom here that was white. And then he said it had this recessed section on the belly of the craft. And in that recessed section, he could see what looked like cross beam and girder construction, very structural construction on this bottom point here. And then there was these series of white lit, backlit windows that had these humanoid figures. And it was his impression that this was a man-made vehicle. That's what his impression was, that these were actually man-made vehicles. This particular individual on the right seemed to be either pointing or waving back to the primary eyewitness. Now, North Wales Triangle, sighted over the M56 motorway on June 1st, 1997, flew across the motorway at about 100 miles an hour, startled people on the motorway, and then zipped off at a high rate of speed. That's all the details we have on that particular case. So now we move on to the ever-present, ubiquitous, everyone's favorite triangle, the TR3B. Anything having to do with the TR3B has to be credited to Edgar Fouché. I want to give him credit for Edgar Fouché. I also want to mention that Edgar Fouché has no first-hand knowledge specifically dealing with this aircraft. So he didn't work on this program, but he claims that he knew people at Area 51 who did. I want to make that perfectly clear. Also want to state that I don't want to divert any way, shape, or form or percentage from his original testimony. I want to give you his straight answers to a number of questions that I brought to his attention. This is his response, so I don't want to divert from anything that he had to say. Technical specifications regarding the TR3B. According to Edgar Fouché, there are 2 different sizes of the TR3B, approximately 250 feet per side for the prototype version, 600 feet per side for the operational model. The overall mission of the TR3B is logistics support and transportation for the Secret Space Command. If used on a planet or moon or large outpost, you would have a ready-made transportable space station. The TR3B carries a crew of 4 in the prototype version. The flight control system used on the TR3B consists of variable vector intake and thrusters on the edges and advanced multi-mode propulsion engines on each tip of the triangle. 2 nuclear reactors serve as the power source for the magnetic field disruptor, also known as an MFD. The magnetic field disruptor utilizes a mercury liquid plasma, which is pressurized to 250,000 atmospheres and rotated at 50,000 RPM, resulting in a distortion or warpage of the localized gravity field by up to 89%. Therefore, G forces are also reduced by 89%. So in effect, what he's saying is that this MFD interacts with how gravity interacts with mass. So you could be doing 1,000 miles an hour, make a left-hand turn 90 degrees, and you'd only feel 11% of the G's. That's what he's talking about. He's not talking about anti-gravity per se, but a disruption of the gravity field. Materials used to construct the TR3B consisted of advanced composites, metamaterials, and titanium. 3 prototype TR3Bs were built. Cost per TR3B in $1990 was $1 billion per craft. Sightings by Edgar Fouché is 1975, high in the atmosphere at night at Edwards Air Force Base, 1976 within the southern part of the Nellis Range, and the late 1970s Groom Air Base. That's the one we want to focus on. TR3B utilizes telescopic landing gear legs with T-pads, operated by the National Reconnaissance Office, the National Security Agency, and the CIA. The craft exhibits very low electromagnetic humming noise during operation. One light was located on each tip of the triangle. The craft incorporates electrochromic panels used for daytime stealth operations. So when you talk about electrochromic panels, what they're essentially doing is they're electronically transferring the image, what's in the back of the craft, to the forward portion. Essentially, the craft serve as variable vectored intake exhaust depending upon which direction the vehicle is going. So this is a drawing put together showing you these vents right here. This is the crew compartment and then the magnetic field disruptor right here. So then I asked Edgar Fouché, Edgar, instead of you just talking about the TR3B, can you give me an illustration of your sighting? This is what he came up with. This is Edgar Fouché's illustration of his sighting. This would have been 1979 at Area 51. This is avionics building number 9, the avionics laboratory at Area 51. Again, this is the longest runway right here. And he was going from the avionics laboratory to a blue blacked out windowed bus, Air Force bus. So it was about a 100-foot walk. And as he's walking to this bus, they had him wear these blacked out welder's goggles so he couldn't see anything around. Edgar Fouché is a pretty big guy, so when he looked down, there was a crack between the top portion of his forehead and the top portion of these welder's goggles, and he could see a crack of light. He looked outside that light and saw the TR3B about 500 feet away. This is according to Edgar Fouché. So if you look at this runway diagram, you look at the buildings, remember these are the red hat hangars right here. We're talking at least 500 feet. So that's how close he got to perhaps one of our classified flying triangles. Again, flying triangles, UFOs, the estimate of the situation, David Marler. This is by Richard Dolan Press, our good friend Richard Dolan. Anyone who's a skeptic regarding flying triangles, please look into this book and you'll see that there's quite a good historical background. I want to make a statement here. If you thought that all triangular UFO cases were the direct result of classified military aircraft, that would be incorrect. Now, how do we know this? Sightings of these triangular shaped craft date back to 1890. Kelly Johnson, who formed the Skunk Works, he wasn't even born yet. So it couldn't be a Lockheed bird, right? It has to be something else. Now, when we talk about these liquid mercury plasma engines on the magnetic field disruptor associated with the TR3B, that's the same thing we hear about on these Vimana aircraft that were 2,000 years before the time of Christ. In the ancient Indian Sanskrit text, they talk about liquid mercury plasma engines with these Vimana type craft. So this technology might date back much earlier than we thought. Is that the same technology that's used here in the Kecksburg Acorn that was recovered in Pennsylvania, December 9th, 1965? Is that the same technology used on the Nazi Bell, 1945? They had the same dimensions, the same configuration, the same bumper around the bottom circumference, the same strange hieroglyphic writing along the bottom. Both the Bell here, it also had these insulating bricks that were associated with test flights. Also, Joseph P. Farrell talked about how plants within the vicinity of test flights of the Bell turned to goo within 2 hours. Scientists who were near the Bell during operation died immediately. He also talks about how there's 2 counter-rotating drums that have a radioactive isotope of mercury called cerium-525 associated with the bell. Now, by May of 1945, Adolf Hitler had 62 of the scientists associated with the Bell program murdered. These were brought up in the trials after Nazi criminal war crimes were brought to public. And so they talked about these 62 scientists being murdered associated with the Bell program. My question is, did SS General Hans Kammler, who was involved in the Bell program, did he cut a deal with the Americans? Did he have his record expunged of any crimes in exchange for technology? That's something we definitely want to keep in mind. Cash Landrum incident, Huffman, Texas, December 29th, 1980. This, by any other means, skeptics cannot debunk this case. This case had stood the test of time for so long now, and I invite anyone who's questioning the validity of some of these cases, please look at this case. You'll find that this has remained rock solid. 3 eyewitnesses, Betty Cash, Vicki Landrum, Colby Landrum, were driving around 9 p.m. Huffman, Texas, when they noticed a bright light approaching their vehicle. It got brighter and brighter and brighter. It got so bright they became horrified. They were scared. It was traumatic. She even mentioned that she thought this was the second coming. She thought this is the end of the world. And what she saw was this twin double ice cream cone craft that was about 90 feet tall, had a series of light-colored blue portholes. We don't know if these were portholes, but they were circular outlets in this location here. It was about 30 feet above the pavement here. She slammed on her brakes. Betty Cash got out of the car, started going to the forward portion of the car to see this thing as a better look. And then it had these strange flames that were blue in color, that every time the flame came out, this craft would bob up. And then once the flames stopped, this craft would start slowly settling down again. This happened for about 2 minutes. At that point, Betty Cash was just about ready to get back into the vehicle. Now, keep in mind, this is December 29th, 1980. It was cold outside. Just about the time she was getting ready to put her hand on that car door, she put her hand there and it burned the skin right. The whole exterior of the vehicle, air conditioning on it was so hot within this vehicle. This craft also emitted a beeping noise as this engine produced this thrust. And then about a minute after this departed, there were no less than 23 double rotor Chinook CH-47s chasing after this craft with 2 UH-1 Hueys in chase with high intensity light beams, like they were shepherding this vehicle, like they had foreknowledge of this particular flight. Now, it's my personal opinion that this was one of ours, ladies and gentlemen. Now, how can I back this up? If you look at this hearing before the Subcommittee on Research and Development, Joint Committee on Atomic Energy, this is the Aircraft Nuclear Propulsion Program, July 23rd, 1959. Once you start looking at this document, you start finding out how much the United States Air Force, the U.S. Navy, the Atomic Energy Commission spent on procurement funding on the NEPA Navy. The Atomic Energy Commission spent on procurement funding on the NEPA program, the Nuclear Energy for Propulsion of Aircraft. Combined, they spent almost $1 billion in 1960. This is a schematic drawing of a liquid-fueled rocket with subcritical reactor. So at least by 1960, they had the procurement funding, the engineering know-how to perhaps build such a craft. Here again, aircraft nuclear propulsion system, different cutaways within that diagram to back this up. So again, we have a legacy of technology, paperwork to back this up. I believe that this was a test flight of one of our that started spewing out fissionable material, and that's how Betty Cash and Vicki Landrum died from the effects of radiation poisoning regarding this. So it's important that we hold our government liable for essentially the murder of these 2 individuals. This case was actually never heard of in court. It was thrown out of court due to lack of evidence. Now, significant statements by Ben Rich regarding advanced aerospace propulsion systems and technology. Ben Rich, very interesting gentleman. I met with his son, Michael Rich, at the graduation. He was very nice, didn't reveal any secrets, but important to keep in mind, Ben took over the reins of the Skunk Works from Kelly Johnson in Burbank back in 1975. He headed the Skunk Works until 1991. And I want to really bring out some points here that I think are very important. According to Ben Rich, and you can verify all of these, they've been authenticated. I invite you to check this out yourself. We did the F-104, the C-130, the U-2, SR-71, F-117, and many other programs that I can't talk about. We are still working very hard. I just can't tell you what we're doing. Wright-Patterson Air Force Base slide presentation, September 26, 1992. Again, the Air Force has just given us a contract to take ET back home. We already have the means to travel among the stars, but these technologies are locked up in black projects. It would take an act of God to get them out to benefit humanity. There is an error in the equations. What equations is he talking about? There is an error in the equations, and we have figured it out and now know how to travel to the stars, and it won't take a lifetime to do it. So what equations is Ben Rich talking about here? It is time to end all secrecy on this, as it no longer poses a national security threat, and make the technology available for use in the private sector. It says we have some new things. We are not stagnating. What we are doing is updating ourselves without advertising. There are some new programs and certain things, some of them 20 or 30 years old, that are still breakthroughs and appropriate to keep quiet about. Other people don't have them yet. And then it says here, September 7th, 1988, AIAA lecture, so you can back that up too. I wish I could tell you about the projects we are currently working on. They are both fascinating and fantastic. They call for technologies once only dreamed of by science fiction writers, according to Ben Rich. What could that mean? Now, this is a new group that maybe some of you haven't heard of before. I got this from the Huntington Library, from the papers of Ben R. Rich. The Skunk Works is always busy. It's fortunate that we are able to turn out a breakthrough about every 10 years. The airplanes that we are building today, you won't hear about for another 10 years. Anything you can think of, we can do. And if not, maybe we have already done it. I cannot talk to you about anything we are doing today or have been doing probably for at least 5 or 10 years. If you saw the configurations I have on my desk today, they're mind-boggling, because if you can think of it, we can design it at the Skunk Works. So that's according to Ben Rich. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't think you're going to get a better group of comments regarding advanced aerospace propulsion systems. Now, John Andrews, who we mentioned before, was very good friends with Ben Rich. These two gentlemen over decades played this word Scrabble game where Ben Rich would kind of submit little hints to John, and that's how he was able to design the F-19 stealth model that turned out to be the highest selling plastic aircraft model of all history. Over 1 million units were sold. So John Andrews wrote a letter in 1986 to Ben Rich regarding his personal opinion of UFOs, even of crash retrievals. This is his original reply letter to John Andrews, dated July 8, 1986. It says, "Dear John, in response to your letter of July 1st, I am a believer, and so is Kelly Johnson." So he's talking about UFOs, extraterrestrial technology. So if it's good enough for Kelly Johnson, to me, it's good enough for me. Now, here is the reply that John Andrews sent back to Ben Rich. He wanted to get some clarification. So Mr. Ben Rich, Lockheed Advanced Aeronautics Company, this is Burbank, California, 10 July 1986. Dear Ben, a short note to clarify your interesting response regarding being a quote-unquote believer contained in your 8th July 1986 letter. The topic is UFO. I believe there are lots of UFOs. I am also tending to believe there are two types of UFOs or categories. A, man-made UFOs. B, extraterrestrial UFOs. I believe with certainty in man-made UFOs. I am tending to believe there are also extraterrestrial UFOs. Having the highest respect for both you and Kelly, I'd appreciate knowing your belief in both categories. So then Ben Rich sent back the letter. I was able to get the actual letter. Lockheed Company letterhead, July 21st, 1986. Dear John, this is a response. Yes, I'm a believer in both categories. I feel everything is possible. Many of our man-made UFOs were unfunded opportunities. In both categories, there are lots of kooks and charlatans. Be cautious, Ben Rich. So the $64 billion question is, what did Ben Rich mean when he talked about unfunded opportunities, UFO? Was Ben Rich talking about programs that didn't get funded at the Skunk Works? Or, as some have suggested, which could be a possibility, was he talking about freebies or hand-me-downs that we got for others? Is that a possibility? It's certainly a possibility. But by 1995, Ben had passed away, so we don't know the answer to that question. Now, a good friend of mine, Jim Goodall, wrote a letter to Ben Rich, basically requesting a taped interview. Just go over a couple of quick points. I would like to do a taped interview with you sometime in the near future. So obviously Jim knew that time was getting short for Ben. He wanted to get all this documented on videotape. It says, we would cover everything that you have ever been involved in with your many years at Lockheed Skunk Works. We would cover all bases, leaving nothing out. He also said that he'd be glad to hold on to that tape for 10 years, 20 years, until he decided that it was appropriate to release into the public domain. Now, unfortunately, that interview never took place because, as we mentioned, Ben Rich passed away in 1995. But just prior to Ben's passing, Jim Goodall got one final telephone in Rich, who was dying at the hospital, and this is what Ben Rich told Jim Goodall: Star Trek, we've been there, done that, or decided it wasn't worth the effort. So again, ladies and gentlemen, I don't think it's going to get any better than that. Talking about technologies that are 50 years beyond what we can comprehend from the Skunk Works. A couple of UFO cases that we should consider here. Hudson Valley boomerang. Between 1982 and 1989, over 25,000 eyewitnesses reported a gigantic chevron or boomerang-shaped craft that hovered over cities north of New York City, about 20 minutes north of New York City. Primary eyewitnesses reported from air traffic controllers, doctors, policemen, law enforcement personnel. What they reported seeing is this boomerang-shaped craft with these tubes, pipes, and cylinders on the bottom of the vehicle, a very structured craft on the bottom. Also had multicolored flashing lights on the bottom as well. That's a very interesting thing to consider because it's been repeated over and over again. Now, March 24th, 1983, Taconic Stark Parkway, New York. This is on a Thursday. Multiple eyewitnesses saw a gigantic 300 feet per side flying boomerang-shaped craft with a triangle trailing edge hover over the Taconic State Parkway. People pulled over to the side of the road, slammed on their brakes, got out of their car, looked up and saw this craft. But then they said when they saw the bottom of it, it had these transparent panels so you could see inside the structure of the craft. And eyewitnesses reported seeing tubes, pipes, cylinders, steel girder, mechanical truss tube construction like a truss bridge. That's what they reported. So I want to ask everyone here, and you don't have to answer, does anyone here know what happened? Anyone here know what happened one day prior to this event? What happened on March 23rd, 1983? Reagan's speech. Thank you. March 23rd, 1983 was Reagan's speech. He proposed the 23rd, 1983. Reagan's speech. Thank you. March 23rd, 1983 was Reagan's speech. He proposed the SDI program. So I asked the question, is there a connection between the Hudson Valley boomerang and the SDI program by Ronald Reagan? Were they using these craft flying over large American cities as a nuclear deterrent, setting up an electromagnetic umbrella protecting us from incoming enemy Russian ICBMs? Is that a possibility? I'm just throwing it out there. Characteristics of the Hudson Valley boomerang. Sightings of the craft came in from Connecticut, New Jersey, and Massachusetts. The craft was virtually silent and measured between 300 and 900 feet across. The UFO was seen hovering over busy expressways, lakes, and rivers. The object was reported by airline pilots, air traffic controllers, doctors, lawyers, local law enforcement, firemen, computer programmers. The craft appeared to have an industrial steel structural girder and crossbeam internal construction like a truss bridge. So what I've tried to do here is I've incorporated every conceivable configuration that was seen by the eyewitnesses. Again, we've got this tubes, pipes, and cylinders that was seen on the bottom of the vehicle, a triangle trailing edge, and then here we've got this section here showing you these transparent panels. Over here, I've shown you the original configuration of the B-2 stealth bomber. This is vintage 1983. Northrop spent $22.3 billion of our tax dollars designing this B-2 stealth bomber. In 1983, they had absolutely nothing to show for our $22.3 billion. At the end of 1983, the Air Force and Northrop decided that they no longer low altitude bombing platforms, and they changed the wing configuration to the double W that we see today. That cost all of us $1 billion for the wing redesign. Now, instead of me just talking about it just by myself, I wasn't there. I want to give you the eyewitness testimony directly from the people who saw this craft. This is Dennis Sant, very respectable gentleman. Here's his quote. This is Philadelphia Inquirer, September 28th, 1984. As it hovered, I could make huge beams, according to Dennis Sant, March 17th, which was a Thursday when this actually took place. Again, Monique O'Driscoll, she sighted the object on March 17th, 1983, on a Thursday. This is her quote, and this is her painting that she made of this craft. I could see the underbelly.
If I say, if I find something, take it home. So find a thing, and you take it, have a thing, put it with the thing like, in other words, if they got this bit of thing or whatever, bit of grasshopper, then they put it with other things, bees or grasshopper. So we do it very simple, and then also tell other people ways around it. So other, I'm really communicating. Sorry, how close do they need to be to the other? The community, well, it depends on what they're doing. So they'll do two things. Firstly, I'm sure they'll see the apologetic where the apps are out marching. Stop, video, yeah? Amps don't march on the line in right? When they're forested, when they're queuing out, they will just kind of, if they're to have a nest, they're not on the app, they'll just spread out the appetite. But when they find something, then they pick it up, and as they are returning the nest, they will then lay a chemical trail. They then get into the nest, and they will perform various behaviors that they might need to encourage their system to remember. And we're still at a minute. All the ants you ever see are female. Yes, male ants, you wouldn't even think they were ants, you'd probably think they were all one. They've got wings, they don't do any work, they're just flying to birds. Their job is to make the virgin queens, and then they die. So the female, the ants, the work ants will then follow that trail. That's what you get when you get a lot of going to sugar to cover or something like that. And you see all these ants all over them. They're all female ants, don't they? They're all female. They're following the chemical trail. Now, if you remember, that could go for a really long way. Because every ant that gets to the end, and it's the sugar or food or whatever, then when they take it out, they will lay the trail again, and that will reinforce the trail. So all these chemical signals would eventually evaporate. If the food source remains, if you've got a big house bag of sugar, it's going to take a long time for them to get it all, and that trail will pretty much turn. You can have fun with it if you're not there with that. You could put on some, if you get some salty tea, if you've got some gin or some vodka, then if you put that on a piece of kitchen towel or something, and you rub that across where the ants are walking, you'll now destroy the trail, taking the chemical away. And you'll see the silt, it's not ants, still what butterflies. In butterflies, the cartoons or the big pictures, exactly what happens, they lose the trail, the ants panic. But eventually, they will find their way out, because they're going to come to the end of the trail, and wait a minute, because there's no signal here, so they'll then start to really randomly, and eventually, one of them will find the trail again. And what you end up now with is a straight line trail, but in the middle of it, you've got a loop, which is where they went round it, and then they said, okay, I found my way back now, and they lay a trail, so the others follow. So you can do very quick experiments with it in your garden or in your kitchen. That is truly remarkable. Bees are the same way, aren't they? Yeah, well, bees do damage. Which is very interesting. You see it on this documentary. When a bee has gone out and found food, it will then return to the little like scouts, right? Yeah, that's absolutely right. They come back and they do it with dance in the harmony, which has sort of waggle back, like in a figure of eight. And trying to decode it with the guy. Von Frisch, who actually discovered that the Latin serpent was actually what the Nobel Prize was. But they do a little waggle in the middle of this figure of eight dance, and that the duration of the dance and the angle of the dance tells the other workers how far they got to fly and what angle was the dance to start. So as the day changes, the same food source will be represented in the dance in a slightly different way. The sun is moving around. Similarly, bees from different latitudes will have a slightly different accent, as it were, because the sun's in a different position on the horizon. If you're on the equator, it's right above you. If you're up where I am, which is quite high latitude, then it's never more than about 30 degrees above the horizon. So the bees are representing the outside world in this little dance. But you see this on video. this one is good. Just putting that out there, the good one. We'll talk a little bit more about that at the top of the hour break, and then we're going to take phone calls with you as well, Matthew. Matthew, stop with us. The name of the book is The Idea of the Brain, The Past and Future of Neuroscience. Find out more about tonight's guest. Log on to coasttocoastam.com. Everywhere on the iHeartRadio app. The podcast, Sun, the radio burner, explores unsolved homicides of three disc jockeys in Miami's Little Indiana. It's an investigation that exposes corruption and drug trafficking, using a portrait of Miami as a forward operating base for the CIA. They using a new constitution and the radio operators. Good luck revolution. That's when it's been started. Listen to Sun, the radio burner, on the iHeartRadio app, or wherever you get your podcasts. Mental health issues affect all of us, even if we don't always want to talk about it with others. This is Mental Health Awareness Day, and if we can talk about it, we can heal it. The Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health cares about your well-being. Come together with your community for events all over the county. Meet others who are going through the same thing. Find resources and enjoy a day taking action for mental health. Events don't begin in June. Visit takeactionlac.com to find one near you. Graduation season is coming. Whether high school or college, one of the best ways you can congratulate your graduate is to start their watch selection. The perfect gift? Go to Box Watches. BoxWatches.com is one of the biggest inventory pre-owned luxury watches. All the watches are certified authentic. If you trade or sell your luxury watches with them too. It's a good time to invest in a Rolex with prices that we saw stronger. Shop online. Open your web browser, Google the keywords Bob's Watches, and my name is Bill Hines. You'll be directed to a list of curated watches and automatically receive $200 off your first purchase online. I just got my Rolex from Bob's Watches. Customer service is something deep. They helped me pick that perfect Rolex for the budget I had in mind, and I got it the next day. So Google the keywords Bob's Watches and Bill Handle for that perfect gift. Bob's Watches and Bill Handle on Google. Jennifer Joe Clean with your Thursday morning wake up call.
I would like to change what I call this Thursday to a breaking mess. Oh my gosh. I know we don't normally tell you what to do here at Amazon. We let you make your own decisions. However, if you would like to take my suggestion, work from home today, don't get on the road until later, just avoid the commute completely. I think I saw at least 2 accidents myself. There were at least 2 slowdowns that I couldn't figure out what in the world they were for. But I mean, significant, 3, 4, 5-minute ones where you're like, no. People are voting carpool lanes shouldn't. I showed me one, but it was just a kind of fend for yourself kind of opinion this morning. And yeah, you can avoid it at all costs. I would highly suggest that you do. Nick Caliopini and Jeff Bob are going to have their hands full this morning. They have the 4th key whiskey boat. Oh, come on, everybody. I have to do it. In fact, last night I was like, who in the world, who came up with the name of 4th key whiskey? So we'll get into that in just a few minutes. And I don't normally do birthday shout-outs, but there is a gentleman who he and his wife have sort of become part of the wake-up call for But here's what I had for your wake-up call. The city manager in the Buda Beach has ordered 2 hotels in the city shut down because of several fights involving armed security guards. State Senator Dave Vin has apologized, I'll tell you why. And lawyers for the Menendez brothers, yes, those Menendez brothers who killed their parents in 1989, are trying to get their client's first-degree murder convictions overturned. I'll tell you what their plan is. We'll also talk with ABC's Karen Travers about the Biden administration reaching a deal with Mexico to talk about the crisis at the border, which is right before Title 42 expires. If you can't come over to the U.S. because of the pandemic. Well, about to be game on, according to border officials. So we'll get into all that in just a few minutes, but let's start with some big stories coming out of the AFI 24-hour newsroom. The city manager in Laguna Beach has ordered 2 hotels in the city shut down. There have been several fights involving armed security guards. Police were called 2 times Tuesday to 18 West and Hotel Laguna for trespassing claims in a fight between officials say it's a civil issue that has resulted in both parties hiring armed security and attempting to force the other from the business. State Senator David Name has apologized. Why? Well, because he apparently was driving under the influence. He posted on Facebook yesterday that his decision to drive the night before was irresponsible. Says he accepts the full responsibility and there is no excuse for his actions. Name represents California's 37th Senate district, which includes about a dozen cities in Orange County. In January, he announced a run for Congress. All 239 LAPD officers killed in the line of duty have been remembered at LAPD headquarters. The officers date back to 1869 when the department was founded. Bagpipers played helicopters flew over the memorial and the fire band was formed. LAPD Commissioner Steve Dobroff says the officers should never be forgotten. There's a whole lot to be said for our fallen years behind. Family, friends, colleagues, the trauma, and what life has been. Yesterday, they placed roses by the officers' names. The LAPD headquarters was fully paid lawyers. Lawyers for the Menendez brothers who killed their parents in 1989 have filed papers in LA to try and get the first-degree murder convictions overturned. Eric and Lyle Menendez claimed they were repeatedly sexually assaulted by their father and feared for their lives. Defense lawyers say 2 new pieces of evidence back up the brothers' allegations, and one of them is this recent allegation that we talked about by a former member of the boy band Menudo, who says he was sexually abused by Jose Menendez as a teenager. You can only have this type of story in Hollywood. Seriously. I'm saying you can't have 2 brothers who murdered their parents, who claim they were sexually assaulted, and then years later, a member of a boy band comes forward and says he was sexually assaulted by the guy that the 2 brothers say they killed because they feared for their lives because he sexually assaulted them. That is, sadly, a complete Hollywood story. When we come back, what is this deal that the Biden administration has made with Mexico regarding the expiration of Title 42? We'll find out in just a few minutes. I don't know where to begin, Nick Calientini. Everywhere is ugly out there. Yeah, this is definitely a news story this morning. So right now, there's something to talk about. All right, I'm going to pick B because I know there was one on the 134. Okay, so everyone's going on the 134 right now. You got a bit of flooding that's out there right now, so that's not looking so good for you. Coming off the 210 out of Pasadena, especially right now, it's going to be slow going for you as you're coming from Roosevelt Boulevard and those heavy delays, especially around Padre, Sierra Marquezella. Looks like it is maybe the right lane, and also they're going to provide us some flooding for you there. Can I really interrupt you? There was, when I was coming in, so it seemed like an hour, 10 minutes to get here this morning. Right when Forest Lawn-ish, this would have been down 134. Do you see anything about a truck on the side of the road? Right there, it's Silverado, over the side of the roadway, east side of the 134 and Victory to off-ramp Stingray right now. Yeah. But yeah, not the illegal way, so we got there in Tampa and Grand City from the eastbound side, so if you're heading eastbound, that's going to be ready for you. Yeah. Westbound side right now, got issues going in right around the interchange of the 134 even been addressed by the cops or the fire department yet. It was just one of those things. And in the dark, when it's pouring rain and you can't see, it's like, oh, not good. No, those moments of blindness, not good at all. Okay, well, maybe some clarity, actually, with the Biden administration and this deal with Mexico to talk about the expiration of Title 42 and what might happen then. So again, what is Title 42 and what's their agreement? Yes, I think that's a good place to start. You know, this is the public health order that's used during the COVID pandemic to keep people from returning across the border. We started during the Trump administration, we continued during the Biden administration. But next week, on May 11th, is the day when the public health emergency for COVID ends by the Biden administration with Title 42 restrictions where we can't keep saying we're going to not let migrants come over the border based on COVID emergency because the emergency will have lifted. So there's a sharp increase at the border that's expected once those restrictions expire. So the administration has been preparing for this. They've been pushing Congress to increase more funding for what they think will be a surge at the border. Hasn't happened yet. So even taking steps that they do on their own. But this agreement with Mexico is something new, but a continuation of what's been done already. But they were really trying to do at the very same time. I sent them to say, look, we're trying to keep things in the order, in the as much as we can. Mexico has always been agreeing to accept the 40,000 migrants originally from Venezuela, India, Nicaragua. They will continue doing that with this agreement with the United States. But yesterday, Green say how many they would continue to accept is that number going to go up because of this surge of the business. And I think what Mexico getting at with this, and it's continuing to accept migrants, and they're giving them funding to do this. But she wouldn't give any details on that. So she wouldn't give any diplomatic conversation. Just saying that Turkey, right, partnership on this in a sovereign country that makes certain decisions. And when it comes to the 1,500 troops that we might be sending to the border, has that become concern at this point? I know that was just being talked about. So it's a done deal. Yes. This is announced this week at the Pentagon. It was the first of the 1,500 active duty troops for a while before it was named to go into the Pentagon. So it was delayed because of the expiration of the Title 42 decision. They're going to be there for 90 days, and the Pentagon says they'll be serving two facilities that ground-based protection and monitoring, data entry and verify the and so it's going to go to protection and figure out how to do that